All right, we are doing the second lecture here on evolutionary psychologies on the mating and reproduction material. You should have received most of 1 and 2 in lecture, in class. I'm going to now talk about 3 and 4 here, some broader sexual dynamics and the moral implications. Just in case I didn't quite finish the female attraction piece in class, I'm going to review that here as well. If in the class you're taking we covered that sufficiently, you can just jump ahead to the broader sexual dynamics. Okay, so we reviewed in the first lecture some concept of reproductive fitness, and then talked about these different kinds of selective pressures that can influence the evolution of organisms. We've talked a lot about sexual selection, so the interplay between males and females in terms of who mates with whom and how that affects our evolutionary wiring. We covered male and female strategies for seeking mates. We covered specifically males and the logic of why males tend to be attracted to markers of youth and how beauty is a proxy for reproductive value. And then we also talked about women's reproductive strategies, so I'm going to pick up here and do this in depth. Okay, so just to remember the evolutionary context, humans were nomadic, they were moving around. The Paleolithic was a tough environment, and it was almost impossible to raise a child by yourself. So in terms of women's strategies, they would be attracted to, in the ancestral environment, partners that appeared to have resources and or appeared to have higher status, because that would enable them to get more resources. So there was this initial attraction, plan A, and you would not only want the richer partner, but someone who's going to be committed to you. So if you think about the ritual around giving a wedding ring or an engagement ring, there's something to that where the man is doing two things. One is showing that he has the resources to support somebody, or at least be supportive. And two, that he's willing to share those resources. The ring is given in a way where if the engagement is called off, it's not typical for the guy to get the ring back. So you can look at that as sexist, and certainly that's a critique you could make, but it also captures some of the dynamics from this evolutionary hardwiring. And just there is a potential problem here, and I think some women would be sensitive to that, in that one of these three guys, at least, has been, that's relatively well known, has been also known to play the field, so to speak, not stay at home as much as maybe he could have. And so there's certain risks that go with being attracted to somebody who has those resources. You got to be sure that they're going to come to you. Okay, so tend to be more attracted to some things that are markers for status, like athleticness, dominance, older, loyalty, etc. So women are going to tend to be attracted to men that are 2 to 3 to 4 years older, whereas you can guess where men would be attracted to when men are younger. They're attracted to that late teens, early 20s kind of range. And when they're older, they're still attracted to that late teens, early 20 range. It's going to bump up a little, but in general, men are kind of targeted on a certain range, and women are targeted on men being a little bit older because they're more likely to have a few more resources. Okay, so just thinking about that, the interaction with the male preference, why are you going to get most marriages in the 20s and 30s? Well, that's when those preferences kind of overlap, right? So college or college age, if women are looking for somebody a little bit older and men are looking for somebody in their late teens, early 20s that have the highest reproductive value. You could see there's a lot of overlap there. Later on, with people as men age and women age, you can see those preferences don't line up quite as well. Okay, so there's also a lot of evidence that women have this behavioral strategy that we could call like a plan B. If plan A is to find a man who's going to have resources and be committed to you, kind of a desirable lifetime mate, that's great. But if women find themselves in environments where there's discordant male-female relationships, or maybe unreliable males, or to take kind of a modern day situation, if you're in an inner city where there are very few jobs, so there are very few males that have access to resources, the strategy that emerges is you get puberty actually starting earlier, menstruation starting earlier, such that and women behaviorally are going to be more, to use the vernacular, promiscuous, which from a scientific perspective we might call that a more active sociosexual orientation. So in other words, they're going to seek out mates, whatever's available, and they are going to tend to have babies earlier, and there's a kind of a quality-quantity trade-off logic that starts here. So the interesting thing is we know that's just not all in somebody's head, because there's this physiological response to these kinds of conditions. Okay. And I just have the mention here, how's that related to current day socioeconomic conditions? So here's another point. If you want to, for example, prevent teen pregnancy, you need to think about the wider socioeconomic conditions in which people find themselves. And they may not be making, quote, bad choices as much as following some deep-seated evolutionary programming. Okay, and then just a few slides here to show some of the divergence in male-female strategies. So in terms of the ideal number of partners, if you're looking at a 1 month, females are looking at one partner, males would prefer 2 partners, and then you go off in the course of the lifetime. So 2 interesting things to note. One is males, by and large, over the lifetime, they would like to have like 16 different relationships. So a lot more than females. They would like a lot more number of sex partners. But you'll notice here that females are not flat. Females increase over time to preferring 4 different sex partners over their lifetime. So for reasons that explained by paternal investment theory, males are going to prefer more partners. But it's interesting to note here that there may be some built-in tendency for women to want to, quote, diversify the portfolio, to have not all their reproductive eggs in the same basket with the same male and his same genes. All right, there's also a difference in whether or not someone would likely agree to sexual intercourse depending upon how long they've known a partner. If they've known somebody 5 years, almost everybody agrees the likelihood of agreeing to intercourse is high for both males and females. But you can see as you move to a shorter period of time you've known each other, females, for example, at 1 hour, they are not very interested in having intercourse, whereas males aren't, but they're not as opposed to it. You can see after a week, males are showing a slight above zero preference for that. Women by no means at all. And so in general, men are inclined to want to have sex a lot earlier than the females do. Okay, and then you can think about what kind of intelligence that somebody wants in a partner. And there are 2 things that are interesting going on here. When you're thinking about somebody that's a steady dating partner or a marriage partner, both males and females report wanting a pretty high IQ for their partner. But if you're just talking about casual sex, there's this big difference, or at least noticeable difference between males and females. Males might be willing to engage in casual sex with someone who is of lower IQ than they would prefer to marry, whereas for women, it's still pretty close to what they would want long term. Okay, and then the divergence around the age at which people would seek divorce. So if you're looking at women to start with, if the people are in their 20s, if the woman is in her 20s, she's much more likely to initiate divorce than men. But as time goes on, women, because they have more sunk costs in the relationship, for example, children, and because as they get older, they have a harder time switching partners, they are less likely to want a divorce. Whereas men, over time, are more likely to be the ones that initiate the divorce. Not very interested in divorce at all when they're younger, and likely when their partner's younger. But as the ages go up, then it's more likely that men will initiate that. Okay, so now some broader sexual dynamics we could talk about. Sex and all our strategies around it are very complex. And part of the reason is it's so central to determining what gets passed on to our children. And therefore, the gene, so to speak, is really interested in things related to sex because it's really close to the fabric of what determines what is either helpful or not helpful in terms of providing reproductive fitness. Okay, so one thing your authors talk about, and I think is useful to think about, is the provisioning hypothesis. It's still a theory that is not 100% accepted by everyone. There's some limitations of it, and some of the data don't fit perfectly. But it's useful at least to think about the way it interconnects several things. So one of the things, and we'll see this when we compare chimps and humans in a second here, but there are these interlocking adaptations. So in other words, it's not as if you just have a graphic equalizer and you can be high on something and low on something. The nature of humans kind of go together in one way, and the nature of chimps go together in one way, and you see very different ways of dealing with sex. So the basic logic of the provisioning hypothesis is humans have these bigger brains, right, relative to our chimpy cousins, and they develop slower. So takes a long time for the little guy to be to the point where he can take care of himself, or she can take care of herself. So for these two reasons, there's a lot of need for calories for the developing brain in here. Brain is a very hungry organ in terms of energy. So there's this need for meat as a high quality source of calories. So that's the background. Also, you got bipedalism coming about that separates us from our ape ancestors, where males can now carry food from a distance. So that supports if you think about hunter and gathering, a way of living, support hunters going out and finding food and being able to bring it back and share it with females and others. You also have this hidden estrus. So with humans, it's hard to tell. It's hidden even from a female sometimes when she is fertile, and that enables pair bonding and monogamy. So the basic logic there is if the male can't tell if the woman is fertile, he has to hang around for a long time. So to make sure, so to speak, that the woman gets pregnant, he has to have intercourse with her over a long period of time. So in other words, they're doing that in a period where she's fertile. So the fact that it's hidden makes it harder for somebody else to monopolize her and her resources without having that long-term interest. So it's really critical that this hidden estrus enables monogamous relationships and prevents alpha males dominating access to females. Okay, so the basic logic here is that meat sharing maybe started initially as kind of an exchange for sex, that females needed to know that the male was interested in her and would provide for her in the long term. And eventually that kind of undergirds or gives an infrastructure for pair bonding, where that some of that food is now provided for the little guy's brain development. You can see him looking up here at the meat going, yeah, that looks pretty good. All right, so to break this out, or to flesh it out, we can compare what goes on with chimps and humans. So with chimps, you see this pattern where the alpha male tends to dominate. There's a dominance hierarchy with somebody at the top and other people at the bottom, and he can lock out other men from having access to females. The estrus is visible. In other words, the chimps are in, so to speak, heat. So the alpha male just needs to dominate them when they are sexually receptive and can ignore them the other part of the time. So alphas can monopolize females. There's no pair bonding. It's a polygamous kind of regime. And that means paternity is unknown. So a given chimp father can't know whether or not it was his sperm or somebody else's that got another chimp pregnant. So you find this pattern of low paternal investment. So the chimps in general the males aren't mean or they're not bad, don't act badly towards offspring, but they don't invest in anyone because they can't know which kid is their own. So it wouldn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective to have that kind of investment pattern. Humans are different. So males are more egalitarian. There's more resistance to one male dominating another small group. Estrus is hidden. So there's less males monopolizing females, and you get more of this pair bonding. The monogamous relationships that we see developing a lot of the time. Now, just FYI, we're not saying that this is lifetime mating per se, but the pair bonding, at least for some period of time, tends to be monogamous. So people may not, in other words, some people get divorced or some people have more than one partner over the course of their life, but there's a tendency for most humans to have just one partner at a time. The other key thing here is that because the paternity is known, because there's this pair bonding that's occurred, the male can have a fairly high confidence that the child he believes really is his. That then leads to greater parental investment. In other words, it can pay out in terms of reproductive fitness if the male invests in his own offspring because he's helping his own genes. So because of that, you get these very different, because of these different sexual systems, you get these different politics and cultures. Humans, males, can invest in females and offspring. Now remember, it's not obligatory, but at least it's an option that has some reproductive payout. So you get less male-male conflict, at least within groups, and greater cooperation, again, within groups. Humans tend to exploit outgroups, but that's a story for another day. Okay, so we're talking through some different sexual dynamics here. There's also this phenomenon where females are cycling. You see how I have a female on a cycle? Isn't that hilarious? So, but what I mean by cycling is that they go through periods of where they drop an egg and they're fertile, and then the egg washes out. But there's a cycle to it. Well, that is largely hidden in humans compared to chimps. Estrus, that is hidden, but you still get some changes that occur. You get the when women are ovulating, there's a glow. The skin is lighter because of the sex hormones. There's the hips are accentuated, and you get behavioral differences too. Unconsciously, women tend to reveal more skin when they're ovulating. But I have one of many diagrams showing healthy, beautiful skin. You can see, given this logic here, why men might be prone to be attracted to glowing, lighter skin. Ergo, you can see why there is a whole cosmetics industry around getting women's skin as beautiful as possible. But you're all beautiful. male, female, whatever. Dogs that are listening, we love you too. Okay, there's some perceptual changes that occur we'll talk about here in a second, and some risks and opportunities. This is revealing more skin, if you want to know why that slide's here. Okay, so some perception changes. This is a fascinating study where they... these characters had men and women wear these t-shirts. They wore them for 3 days without bathing. I know, disgusting. They froze them, and then they had males and females pick their preferred t-shirts. The males chose the scents that correlated with female facial attractiveness, and the females chose the t-shirts that were from males that had greater symmetry. You might say, what are you talking about with the symmetry thing? Here's some it's computer simulations of symmetry, but you can see the ones on the left are symmetrical and the ones on the right are less symmetrical. And you might look at the ones on the right. To me, they don't look unsymmetrical. They just don't look as pretty as the ones on the right. Or handsome, I should say. Whatever. But you can see that there's differences that women are sensitive to when they are ovulating. When they're not ovulating, they are not sensitive to that. Okay. And you also see female desire shifts with these cycles. So Arslan and some others in 2018 examined these diaries where they had people identify their different kinds of fantasies, and sexual fantasies included. And what they found was that two things occurred. People fantasize more about their current partner, and they fantasize more about other partners. And there was this pattern where overall they were more interested in their current partner, but you got this other thing going on down here. And they got these shifts that occurred that mapped onto the ovulation cycle. What was fascinating is they also looked at women that were on the pill, and the pill basically stops some of those sex hormones from cycling. You see that they don't really differ across that same time frame. So you can see a definite impact in women's what they're thinking about based on the ovulation cycle. All right, and this is a little surprising, but it may even shape political views. So this study took advantage of some biases in the way our society is constructed. These are kind of uncomfortable facts, but it helped them create this interesting study. So it's a fact. Different cultures are prejudiced in different ways. Ours happens to be prejudiced against seeing black men as dangerous. And there's this finding where white women then show greater racial prejudice when they are ovulating. So the logic behind that is when you are ovulating, you have a chance of a good thing or a bad thing happening. Good thing would be getting pregnant from a guy that you want to have as a mate, but there's the risk in that other people may use coercion to mate with you, and that would not be a desirable outcome. So you get this tick up in prejudice, which is typically interpreted as this anti-coercion self-defense mechanism. Okay, so another thing they exploited in this study is people vary in how they interpret someone's skin tone. So they took different skin tones from Obama they found across the internet. So I have two here. One where he looks like he has a darker skin tone and one where he has a lighter skin tone. And they just asked people from memory to say, where would you put Obama on this scale? So that allowed them to categorize people that saw Obama as more white and people that saw Obama as more black. Okay, so their hypothesis was that ovulating women are going to react differently to Obama depending on how they racially categorize him. They think if they see him as black, it's going to be less favorable, and if they see him as white, they'd be more favorable. In other words, if they're ovulating and they see Obama as a potential coercion threat, they're going to rate him less desirably as a politician. They're going to be less likely to say they'll vote for him. But if they see him as white, in other words, consistent with their own racial classification, they're going to be inclined to see him as this ideal mate that's smart, articulate, wealthy, all these other things. And so the dependent variable was likelihood of voting for Obama. So result number one, they found that as people's conception risk increased, in other words, as they were more likely to become pregnant, if they saw Obama as white, their propensity to desire voting for him went up. If they saw Obama as black, it went down. So this suggests that depending on how they saw him, the conception risk they were experiencing drove them in different directions in terms of their preference for voting for Obama. And interestingly enough, they replicated this, or they found when they broke it out by liberals and conservatives, they found the same pattern. So even though liberals overall were more inclined to say that they would vote for Obama, you get the same pattern, and conservatives overall are less inclined to vote for Obama, but you get the same pattern. Those that see him as white become more attracted to him as the conception risk increases. In other words, they're more likely to vote for him. And those that see him as black, you see this precipitous drop. Okay, so the takeaway, ovulating women are more attracted to ideal mates and more fearful of dangerous mates. Some quick side effects here. One, this is no way saying that racial prejudice is a good thing. And two, it's not saying that women are somehow less reliable as voters or something because they ovulate. Men there's a bunch of studies that show that male behaviors and attitudes vary with levels of testosterone. And in general, males, at least if you, we'll just leave that there. But males have plenty of things in which they're more likely to be aggressive or prejudiced relative to females. So it's by no means just picking on females. Okay, so we spent most of our focus on the long-term mating kind of thing. But as that data that we looked at with the Obama study just showed, you get these patterns that change in the short term about who people find attractive and who they don't. So in general, we have this monogamous tendency among humans. We tend to have one partner at a time. But there's some evidence that we are polygamous. In other words, we're kind of a mixed model. So these numbers vary based on what studies you look at, and it's hard to get people to be honest about something like extramarital affairs, but something like 50% of married men report it, and something like 30 to 50% of women. I think I've seen some recent studies where these numbers are a lot lower for women, but at any rate, it's not zero. And you see this, it show up in various ways. So mothers oftentimes, 80% of the time when they're making a judgment about who the baby looks like, will liken the baby to the father. So there's a suggestion there that there's some kind of inborn tendency to try to sell the offspring as related to the father in hopes of increasing parental investment. So obviously probably not conscious on either party's part, but that's the research. Okay, so what are the advantages of short-term mating? So for males, given the lower parental investment option, that should be kind of obvious, right? That if you can get some extra gene sets out there without having to abandon your current partner or for just a short fling, then it makes sense. From females, there's also an incentive. It's not as strong, but females have an incentive to diversify the portfolio, so to speak. If all their genetic material is tied up with the same man, that is less just like investing in stocks, it's less likely to perform well in the long term. It's more at risk, in other words, because you have all your eggs in one basket. So you get some benefits from potentially investing in different genes. And there's also some evidence if females are going to have a fling, that they're more inclined to do it with somebody that has really good genes. Usually somebody that's very attractive would be the way we'd read that. Okay, so some evidence for this. There's the Coolidge effect that your authors talk about. So in other words, males that there's a story about Mrs. Coolidge, the wife of the president, asked how often the rooster, the male chicken, mated, and they said, oh, multiple times a day. And she said, well, why don't you mention that to Mr. Coolidge, kind of picking on her husband. And her husband, when told this, said, is it always the same chicken? And they said, oh, no, it's with a bunch of different chickens. And he said, you might mention that to Mrs. Coolidge. So in other words, males, if presented with the same chicken they've just had sex with, are less likely to become aroused and want to mate again. But if you present a male with a different chicken, then they get more excited. So that same thing happens with human males. So for females, you will see this tendency. They don't only just fantasize about relationships with their current partner, they fantasize about different partners. And you see a similar kind of timing pattern here. Okay, and then finally, a bit more evidence. There's sperm competition. So when males are separated from females and they're reunited and they're having intercourse, when they come back from vacation, so to speak, there's more sperm. So there's some evidence that that is an evolved tactic to make it more likely that you are the one that gets the woman pregnant. And as the authors point out, the fact that this is an adaptation for males suggests that there must be some females out there that are willing to engage in these short-term flings, or otherwise males couldn't be adapted to do it. Okay, and then also there's killer sperm. I know that sounds like an upcoming movie, preferably in 3D, but there's the kind of sperm that can help fertilize an egg, and then there's the kind of sperm that kills other sperm. So humans have both kinds, and if you look at chimps, only 1% of their sperm is not killer sperm. So if you remember, chimps are polygamous, so there's lots of sexual competition there. Humans, it's not that high, but we still definitely have two types, suggesting that if you have sperm on sperm violence, so to speak, that there's some polygamy going on that has arisen from. Okay, and then I'll tell you my mother's euphemism, just because it's funny, describing a cousin of mine that had some infidelities in his track record. Her euphemism was, he had trouble staying home. So as that suggests, anytime you're talking about sex and what people actually do, it's hard to study because people have such a strong incentive not to be fully honest. And you can see this that comes up, unfortunately, in some DNA family tree testing where you have a brother and a sister and they think they're full brother and sister, and it turns out they're half brother and sister because one of the parents they thought was the parent isn't really the parent. Okay, so polygamy, we actually are fighting over females. Evidence for that comes from sexual dimorphism. So males tend to be bigger than females in some species. So if you look at lions here, or these are baboons, males versus females, big size difference. With humans, it's not a huge difference. But the fact that there is some suggests that larger size would be useful for potentially defeating other males to get access to females. So that suggests that there was coercion and other things that went on, at least in the ancestral environment. And interestingly enough, in societies that do have more polygamous relationships, you'll see more head coverings and body coverings of women, probably because there is more free radicals out there. In other words, there's more men out there that don't have partners, and so there's more mate poaching that's possible. Okay, and then on a darker note, I think it's worth mentioning, because we'll talk about this when we get to ideology, that there's strong evidence that males historically have engaged in coalitional violence. So you see this in chimps. Chimps will, a bunch of males will go out and patrol the perimeter of their territory, and if they find a male from another territory, they will try to kill him. It makes sense from an evolved perspective in that you're decreasing the strength of potential competing bands, and if you can, in a group of people, kill a straggler from another group without any danger to your own, from an evolutionary perspective, just a pure reproductive fitness perspective, why not? So we see in our species similar kinds of things. From a young age, boys are fascinated by and play war and different kinds of things related to war. Sports in our society is really a proxy for different kinds of combat between different tribes, so to speak. And there's a bunch of interesting studies that connect this stuff. So they took some people and they showed males and females attractive or unattractive faces of members of the opposite sex, and none of that had an impact on their support for war, except males that were shown attractive but not unattractive faces of females increased their support for war. So that suggests that somewhere deep in the male mind is the thought that if I go to battle, if we go to war, I might have access to more females. And you just think about, I mentioned the idea of affordances before. If you vanquished another tribe and taken all their stuff, and you've killed off all the men, which is how it tend to work in ancient war, then you have a bunch of extra resources there in terms of cold logic. In other words, you have access to those females. So there's some evidence just in our DNA history. We mentioned this before, but 8% of Asian men are descendants of Genghis Khan. So that suggests that when Genghis Khan was showing terror across the Asian steppes, that he had many relationships with females that produced offspring, and those relationships were most likely very coercive. Okay, so in terms of, and I just have some books here. One is reinterpreting some Greek myths like Homer and the Odyssey, and all the ways in which fights over women led to war, and then the stealing and the raping of women that occurred in those stories. There's a famous book on some of these tendencies for warfare and coercion called Demonic Males. And then there's a recent book about the impact of war on women. And it's a dark topic that women themselves oftentimes are not, for evolutionary reasons, not wanting to talk about what happened. But I think it's worth, from a social justice standpoint, being aware that there's this huge cost that occurs to women in war that we need to be aware of. Okay, and then speaking again on another dark topic, but there's been debate about whether or not rape is a assertion of some kind of sex interest or an assertion of power. So many feminists, for reasons that I have great sympathy for, have argued that it's more about power. In other words, they're trying to say it's not some biological thing. It's some larger kind of social agenda to suppress women. And that the implicit logic there is, if it's not biological, it's more easily shaped and more easily addressed by society. However, there's a good bit of evidence that suggests it is linked to sex, that it is some kind of dark reproductive strategy. So if you look at pregnancy rates from consensual sex, it's actually a lesser chance of getting pregnant than from rape, again suggesting that there is some evolutionary payout there from it. And then most I think convincingly, if you look at the age of the victims, here we have the age of the victims for both of female victims of both murder or rape. And the color's off here, I'm sorry, but the blue line is rape. You can see that murder, they're both violent crimes, right? So we should assume that they're going to have a similar pattern, but you can see the murder rates
average out around 40, the average age, but the average age of a woman who is sexually assaulted is a lot lower, closer to when they had the highest reproductive value. So this pattern suggests that at least some of the motivation for the rape step is coming from some kind of dark evolutionary wiring. Okay, so that raises, I think it's important to end on some moral implications of all this evolutionary stuff. First off, facts do not dictate morality. So just because we have a tendency to do something does not mean that we need to think it's a good thing. So we all have a tendency to die. I don't think anyone would argue that that is something that we're really wild about. Also, it doesn't require that we be passive. I think if we recognize there's certain things like sexual coercion that we don't like and we think is morally reprehensible, then it's, I think, better to have a clear-eyed view of what's actually going on and why it might be motivated. We can construct societies that achieve these social goods, and I think it's helpful if we have a deeper understanding of the potential tendencies that can give us some agency there. So we have a long history of social institutions shaping behavior. Marriage would be a huge example. If you're trying to constrain choices that males and females make, marriage is this way in which that it's much more likely to keep people together in the long run for the benefit of children if there's some kind of sanction of the marriage. Education is a huge social intervention that really changes the way people approach problems, promotes greater equality. Women who are educated tend to delay childbearing for a few years, which gives them more options. And certain kinds of education, at least, can really help with critical thinking and perspective taking, and stepping outside of yourself to see someone else's perspective. And then citizenship. So the idea of equality before the law, social welfare programs supporting individuals and marriages. But if there are deficiencies that we have from our evolutionary wiring, there's no reason why we can't work to address those through social interventions that protect people and make it more likely that people will be kind to each other and that we can maximize the values we care about. All right, that is it for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed.